Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation details historical events involving extreme violence, brutality, and the conquest of indigenous peoples. The content may be disturbing to some audiences. He was not a king. He was a god. Stripped bare, his body was coated in a sticky layer of tree resin, and then piece by piece, he was covered in pure gold dust. From the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, he became a living, breathing statue of solid gold. He was El Dorado, the gilded man pushed onto a raft laden with emeralds and golden offerings. He was rowed to the center of a sacred lake, high in the Andes Mountains. As the sun hit his skin, he would have been blinding to look at, a beacon of impossible wealth. Then, as his people watched from the shore, he would wash the gold from his body, casting it into the dark, silent water below, a sacrifice to the gods who lived in the deep. This was the ritual, a ceremony of immense spiritual power. It was never meant to be a treasure map, but the stories traveled. Whispers carried on the wind, passed from tribe to tribe, from mountain villages to coastal jungles. And when those whispers reached the ears of the Spanish conquistadors, they heard something very different. They didn't hear about a ritual. They didn't hear about gods or sacrifice. They heard only one word, gold, and they misunderstood everything. They twisted the story of a gilded man into the legend of a gilded city, a place of unimaginable riches, where the streets were paved with gold, the buildings were made of gold, and the king washed himself in gold every single day. They called this city El Dorado, and in their quest to find it, they would unleash a 300-year nightmare of greed, obsession, and death that would consume an entire continent. They were searching for a city that never existed. But what if, in their blind lust for treasure, they missed the real prize? What if the true secret of El Dorado wasn't about a city, but about a location so sacred, and a treasure so vast, that its guardians have kept it hidden for over 500 years, protected by a legacy of blood and a conspiracy of silence? Before the ships arrived, before the steel swords and the gunpowder, the mountains of what we now call Colombia were home to the Muisca people. They were master craftsmen, astronomers, and farmers, living in a sophisticated society among the high Andean plains. And they had a unique relationship with gold. To them, gold wasn't currency. You couldn't buy a house with it or trade it for food. It had no material value. It had something far more important: spiritual value. They called it the sweat of the sun, a divine metal that was a direct connection to their gods. They didn't mine it for wealth. They crafted it into spectacular offerings. Tiny, intricate figures known as tunjos, warriors, mothers, animals, each one a prayer made solid, a piece of the sun given back to the earth. They would leave these offerings at sacred sites, in caves, on mountaintops, and most importantly, at the bottom of their holy lakes, like Lake Guatavita, the very site of the Gilded Man ceremony. For the Muisca, sinking gold into the water wasn't a loss of wealth. It was an investment in the cosmic balance of the universe. Then, in the early 1500s, the world broke. The conquistadors arrived. Men like Francisco Pizarro and Hernán Cortés, fresh from toppling the Aztec and Inca empires, were driven by a pathological hunger for gold. For them, gold was the ultimate prize. It was power, it was status, it was God's favor made manifest. They saw the intricate gold work of the indigenous peoples not as sacred art, but as raw material to be melted down into bars, stamped with the seal of the Spanish crown, and shipped back to Europe to fund their endless wars. It was the greatest clash of worldviews imaginable. One culture saw gold as a spiritual offering to be given away. The other saw it as a commodity to be taken, by any means necessary. And when the Spanish heard the first fragmented rumors of the Muisca's golden ritual, their minds ignited with a feverish vision. The legend began to grow, mutating with every telling. The story of a gilded man became a gilded king. The gilded king must have a gilded palace. The gilded palace must be in a gilded city. Soon maps began to appear, drawn from hearsay and desperation, placing this mythical metropolis deep in the uncharted heart of South America. They called it Manoa, a city on the shores of a massive lake called Parim. Its supposed location shifted constantly, first in the Andes, then east into the plains of Venezuela, then south, deep into the suffocating green hell of the Amazon rainforest. It was a phantom, a mirage that danced just beyond the horizon, always out of reach. But for the thousands of men who would chase it, the mirage was more real than the world around them. They sold their homes, left their families, and signed on for expeditions into a land they knew nothing about, all for the promise of a city built from a lie. The first to truly chase the ghost was Gonzalo Pizarro, the brother of the man who conquered the Inca. In 1541, he assembled one of the largest expeditions the New World had ever seen. Over 200 mounted Spaniards, thousands of enslaved native porters, and a herd of livestock set out from Quito, in modern-day Ecuador, and marched east into the Amazon. They were supremely confident, clad in steel armor, believing their technology and their faith made them invincible. The jungle thought otherwise. The rainforest was not a treasure chest waiting to be opened. It was a living, breathing predator. Within weeks, their heavy European clothes were rotting off their bodies in the suffocating humidity. Strange fevers burned through the camp, killing dozens. Their food supply dwindled, and they were reduced to eating their own dogs and horses, then insects, then boiling their leather belts for sustenance. The promised land of cinnamon groves and golden cities never appeared. Instead, they found only endless miles of impenetrable vegetation, venomous snakes, and tribes who met their quest for gold with poison-tipped arrows. The deeper they went, the more the jungle stripped them of their humanity. The conquistadors, starving and desperate, became monsters, torturing any native they could capture, demanding to know the way to El Dorado. But the natives only knew the jungle, and the jungle was their only answer. After a year of relentless horror, Gonzalo Pizarro's grand expedition had completely fallen apart. Starving, half-naked, and driven mad by their failure, the few survivors finally staggered back to Quito. Of the thousands who had set out, only a handful remained. They had found no gold, no city, no glory. They had found only death. But their failure did not kill the legend, fed it. The very fact that Pizarro's massive expedition had been swallowed whole by the jungle only proved, in the twisted logic of the gold-fevered mind, that the treasure it was hiding must be even greater than they had ever imagined. The search for El Dorado was just beginning, and the price paid in human lives was about to get much, much higher. The first major expeditions, fueled by German banking money and a thirst for glory, had ended in ruin, in starvation, in cannibalism. But they had failed in the most tantalizing way possible. They hadn't disproven the legend. They had only deepened the mystery. And as news of their doomed quest, and the rumors of gold they chased, filtered back to the coastal colonies, it didn't serve as a warning. It acted as gasoline on a fire. The new wave of hunters wouldn't be German bankers playing conquistador. They would be the real thing. Hardened Spanish veterans, men who had seen the fall of the Inca and the Aztec, men who knew the smell of gold and the weight of blood. Enter Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. He wasn't your typical brutish conqueror. He was a lawyer from Granada, a man of letters, educated and sophisticated. But the New World had a way of stripping civilization away, layer by layer, until only the raw primal greed remained. In 1536, with a commission from the Spanish crown, Quesada was tasked with a seemingly straightforward mission: march south from the Caribbean coast, up the massive, unforgiving Magdalena River, and find an overland route to Peru. But everyone knew the real mission. The official papers were just a cover. The real objective was to find the source of all the stories, the kingdom that was supposedly leaking gold into the rest of the continent. Quesada assembled a force of nearly 900 men, not just soldiers but priests, craftsmen, and enslaved Africans and natives forced to carry the crushing weight of their supplies. They were a microcosm of the Spanish colonial world, plunging headfirst into a world that wanted them dead. The journey up the Magdalena was a vision of hell. The river itself was a monster, its currents pulling men under, its banks a tangled, suffocating wall of green. Every inch of progress was paid for. Poisonous snakes dropped from branches. Jaguars stalked their camps at night, their eyes glowing just beyond the firelight. Unseen natives fired poison darts from the dense foliage, turning a soldier's momentary lapse in concentration into a slow, agonizing death. And then there was the disease: malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. Men's bodies wasted away, their skin turning a sickly yellow, their minds lost to delirium. The humidity was a physical presence, rotting their clothes, their leather armor, and their food. They ate their horses, then their dogs. Then they were reduced to boiling their leather sword belts and shields, chewing on the softened hide for any pathetic scrap of nourishment. Of the 900 men who started the journey, only 200 were still alive after 8 months. They were skeletons, ghosts haunting the jungle, their armor rusted, their eyes hollowed out by hunger and fever. Most commanders would have turned back. Most would have admitted defeat. But Quesada was not most commanders. He was driven by something beyond reason. He had heard whispers from captured natives, stories, when translated through a chain of interpreters, that spoke of a powerful civilization high in the mountains. A people who lived on a vast plateau, far above the sweltering jungle. A people who were masters of salt, of emeralds, and of gold. He pushed his men onward, upward, out of the green hell of the lowlands and into the thin, cold air of the Andes Mountains. And there they found them, the Muisca. This wasn't a scattered collection of jungle tribes. This was a civilization. They had towns, roads, a complex political structure, and a sophisticated religion. They were weavers, farmers, and above all, master craftsmen. When Quesada and his ragged survivors stumbled out of the wilderness and onto the Bogotá savanna, they must have looked like specters of death. But the Muisca, who had never seen horses or steel weapons, were initially paralyzed by shock and awe. This was the moment the legend began to crystallize into a terrible reality. Because the Muisca were the people of the ceremony. They were the people of the Gilded man. Quesada's men, their hunger for food now replaced by an insatiable hunger for treasure, fell upon the Muisca civilization. They found what they were looking for. Not a city with streets paved in gold, not yet, but they found temples adorned with golden offerings. They found Muisca leaders, the Zipas and Zacs, who wore finely wrought breastplates, crowns, and jewelry of pure gold. They plundered tombs and found emeralds the size of a man's fist. They tortured village chiefs, demanding to know the location of the source, the great treasure they knew had to be hidden somewhere. They amassed a fortune. By any standard, the expedition was a staggering success. Quesada had found the people behind the legend. He had found the Kingdom of Gold. He declared the land a new Spanish territory, the new Kingdom of Granada, and founded the city of Santa Fe de Bogotá on the ruins of a Muisca village. He had done it. He had found El Dorado, or so he thought. He had found the ritual, the ceremony, the people. But the myth had already grown larger than the reality. The idea of a lost city, a place made entirely of gold, was now so embedded in the European mind that finding the mere Kingdom of Gold wasn't enough. The ghost was still out there. And then, something impossible happened. As Quesada and his men were counting their loot, marveling at their survival and their newfound wealth, lookouts brought staggering news. An army was approaching from the south. A Spanish army, led by Sebastián de Belalcázar, one of Francisco Pizarro's most ruthless lieutenants from the conquest of the Inca in Peru. He had heard the same rumors, the whispers of a golden kingdom to the north, and had marched his own army through hundreds of miles of treacherous mountains to find it. The two groups of conquistadors stared at each other across the high plateau, a mixture of disbelief and murderous intent. They were both Spanish, but they were rivals. This was their prize. Before they could even decide whether to greet each other as countrymen or kill each other as competitors, the situation became even more absurd. A third army appeared. This one came from the east, from the plains of Venezuela. It was led by Nicolaus Federmann, one of the German conquistadors who had survived the earlier, disastrous expeditions. His men were just as ragged, just as starved, and just as desperate as the other two armies. Think about this for a moment. 3 separate expeditions starting from points thousands of miles apart, the Caribbean coast, Peru, and Venezuela. None knew of the other's existence. All of them had independently followed the siren song of El Dorado. All had endured unimaginable hardship, losing the vast majority of their men to disease, starvation, and battle. And through sheer impossible coincidence, all 3 had arrived at the exact same spot, on the same high Andean plateau, within weeks of each other. It is one of the most bizarre moments in the history of exploration. 3 armies led by 3 ambitious, violent, and gold-crazed men, converging on a prize they all believed was theirs by right of conquest. The air on the Bogotá savanna was thick with tension. There were fewer than 500 conquistadors left in total, but they were the hardest, most ruthless survivors of 3 separate apocalypses. They were ready to finish the job by slaughtering each other. A 3-way battle for a phantom city, a war for a legend, the fate of a kingdom, and the future of the search for El Dorado, hung on the razor's edge of a single fateful decision. The air on the high savanna of Bogotá was thin, and stretched even thinner by a tension that could snap at any moment. 3 armies, or what was left of them, stared each other down. Not Muisca warriors but fellow Europeans. 3 ghosts who had clawed their way out of hell, only to find 2 other devils waiting for them. There was Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, the lawyer from Granada. His men, gaunt and fever-ridden from their 9-month death, march up the Magdalena River. They were the ones who had conquered the Muisca, who had stood in the empty temples and seized the golden offerings. By right of conquest, this land was theirs. But then from the south came Sebastián de Belalcázar, a veteran hardened by the brutal campaigns in Peru alongside Francisco Pizarro. His men were better equipped, better fed, and he had something Quesada desperately lacked: horses. His force was a professional killing machine, and his eyes, which had seen the riches of the Inca, now gazed upon this new kingdom with a hungry sense of entitlement. And as if summoned by the scent of blood and gold, a third specter appeared from the east. From the suffocating plains of Venezuela staggered the German Nikolaus Federman. His men were wraiths, dressed in animal skins, their bodies scarred by starvation and battles with indigenous tribes. They were the desperate long shot, the wild card with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. 3 commanders, 3 ragged armies, all converging on the same spot on the globe, drawn by the same fever dream. They hadn't found a city of gold. They had found each other. And the prize was no longer a mythical kingdom, but a very real one. The newly conquered land of the Muisca. The logic of the conquistador was simple. What you cannot take, you destroy. A battle was inevitable. A 3-way bloodbath that would have annihilated them all, leaving their bones to bleach under the Andean sun. A final grim monument to their shared obsession. But something unexpected happened. Perhaps it was the sheer exhaustion. Perhaps it was the chilling realization that after surviving jungles, mountains, and hostile warriors, they were about to be undone by their own countrymen. Or perhaps it was the cold, calculating pragmatism that lurked beneath their violent ambitions. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, after all, was not a soldier by trade. He was a man of law. And so, in one of the most bizarre moments in the history of the conquest, instead of drawing swords, they agreed to talk. Imagine the scene. 3 of the most ruthless men in the New World, sitting down not for a war council, but for a negotiation. A devil's bargain on the roof of the world. Belalcázar had the strongest army. Federman had the desperation of a cornered wolf. But Quesada had the home field advantage. He had founded the city of Santa Fe de Bogotá right there on that plain. He held the territory. He argued that he was the legitimate authority. Belalcázar scoffed, pointing to his cavalry and cannons. Federman, meanwhile, likely just wanted a share, a payoff to make his horrific journey worthwhile. For days the 3 armies watched each other, trigger fingers tense, while their commanders haggled. It was a stalemate. A battle would be mutual suicide. A retreat meant forfeiting the prize. The solution they devised was as audacious as it was unprecedented. They decided to let someone else solve their problem. They would not fight. Instead, all 3 of them would return to Spain together. They would travel as equals to the royal court and present their competing claims directly to the ultimate authority, the Emperor Charles V. They would let the king decide who would be governor of the new kingdom of Granada. It was an absurd plan. 3 bitter rivals, entrusting their fortunes to a transatlantic voyage and the whims of a distant monarch. They left their armies behind under the command of their lieutenants, with strict orders to keep the peace. The 3 captains of conquest then began their journey home, sharing a ship down the Magdalena River, the very waterway that had almost claimed Quesada's life. What must those conversations have been like? The stilted dinners, the guarded glances, each man sizing up the others, trying to divine their strategy for the political battle that lay ahead. They had traded a war of swords for a war of words, a battlefield of mud and blood for a kingdom of paper and ink. When they finally arrived in Spain, they were not greeted as heroes. The royal court and the powerful council of the Indies were not impressed by their discovery. They were horrified by the reports of chaos, of unauthorized expeditions, of 3 private armies nearly coming to blows thousands of miles from royal oversight. This wasn't exploration, this was anarchy. The crown didn't want daring conquistadors who acted like kings. It wanted obedient bureaucrats who would fill the royal coffers. The judgment, when it came, was a masterclass in imperial power and crushing irony. The king, in his wisdom, gave the grand prize to none of them. Sebastián de Belalcázar, the powerful veteran, was given a consolation prize, the governorship of a nearby, less important province. Nikolaus Federmann, the German, was immediately entangled in a web of lawsuits by his employers, the Welser banking family, who accused him of misconduct and treasure hoarding. He would die in prison a few years later, penniless. And Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, the man who had actually marched into Muisca territory, who had faced their armies, who had founded Bogotá and conquered the kingdom, he got nothing. Less than nothing. He was charged with a litany of crimes, mistreating the natives, killing the last Muisca king, and mishandling royal funds. He spent years mired in legal battles, forbidden from even returning to the land he had conquered. The three men who had raced to claim El Dorado had all lost. They had flown too close to the sun, and their wings were melted not by jungle heat, but by the cold, indifferent fire of bureaucracy. But the legend itself was immune to royal decrees. It was more powerful than any king or conquistador. With the Muisca treasure chests now empty and their conquerors exiled, the story of El Dorado should have died right there on the plains of Bogotá. But it didn't. It simply moved. The treasure found among the Muisca was immense, but it wasn't a city. It wasn't a solid gold metropolis. For the ever-hopeful, ever-greedy colonists, this meant only one thing. The real El Dorado, the source of all this wealth, must be somewhere else. The rumors began to shift. The stories told by captured natives, perhaps tortured, perhaps just telling the Spaniards what they wanted to hear, started pointing in a new direction. Not south, not north, but east. East, beyond the towering peaks of the Andes. East, into the vast, green, and terrifying mystery that stretched to the horizon. The Amazon, a place they called the Land of Cinnamon, a region rumored to hold not just valuable spices, but cities of unimaginable wealth, hidden beneath a canopy of endless jungle. And in Quito, in what is now Ecuador, another man heard these whispers. A man with a name that carried the weight of destiny and a reputation for utter ruthlessness. He was the brother of the man who had toppled the Inca Empire. He had gold in his veins and an insatiable hunger for more. His name was Gonzalo Pizarro. As Quesada, Belalcázar, and Federmann faded into history, Pizarro began to assemble the largest and most lavishly equipped expedition the New World had ever seen. He was going to march east into the jungle to find the El Dorado that had eluded the others. He was certain he would succeed where they had failed. He had no idea he was marching not towards a city of gold, but into the deadliest trap on the continent, a green hell that would swallow his army and his sanity whole. Gonzalo Pizarro was not just any conquistador. He was the younger brother of Francisco Pizarro, the man who had toppled the entire Inca Empire with a handful of soldiers. Conquest was in his blood. Pride was his inheritance. Where others saw impenetrable jungle, Gonzalo saw a challenge to his family's legacy. Where they felt fear, he felt ambition. In 1541, from the high-altitude city of Quito, he launched what would be the largest and most expensive expedition ever mounted in the search for El Dorado. This was not a desperate gamble. In his mind, it was a coronation. The numbers alone were staggering. Over 200 Spaniards, clad in polished steel, armed with harquebuses and razor-sharp Toledo swords. They were accompanied by 4,000 native porters, men forced from their highland homes to carry the expedition's immense baggage train into a world they feared. A herd of 2,000 pigs was driven before them, a walking larder for the campaign. Thousands of llamas followed, burdened with supplies. And with them a pack of snarling war dogs, veterans of the brutal Incan conquest, trained to hunt and kill men. This was an army of conquest, a rolling city of steel and flesh, marching east with the arrogant certainty that history was on its side. Gonzalo Pizarro, astride his magnificent charger, was not just seeking a city of gold. He was going to claim his kingdom. The first trial was the Andes. They climbed through treacherous mountain passes, the air growing thin and knife-sharp. The cold was a physical blow, seeping through armor and leather, chilling men to the bone. Snow and ice turned the paths into deadly slides, sending pack animals and unfortunate porters screaming into the abyss below. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape, but it was a known enemy. They were Spaniards, men forged in the mountains of Extremadura. They could endure the cold. They could endure the climb. They saw it as a test of their resolve, a crucible that would burn away the weak and leave only the worthy to claim the prize on the other side. They had no idea that the mountains were not the filter, they were the gateway. And on the other side lay a hell they could not have imagined in their worst fever dreams. After weeks of torment, they began their descent from the icy peaks. And the world changed. The thin, cold air was replaced by a thick, wet blanket of heat that choked the breath from their lungs. The landscape exploded into a riot of green so dense, so absolute, that it seemed to swallow the sky. They had marched out of the mountains and into the Amazon rainforest. And then the rain began. It wasn't the rain they knew from Spain, or even the storms of the Andes. This was a biblical deluge, a ceaseless vertical ocean that fell for weeks on end without a moment's pause. It turned the jungle floor into a quagmire of sucking mud that pulled at their boots with every step and could swallow a horse whole. Their fine clothes rotted on their backs. Their leather boots and saddles grew a coat of green mold and fell apart. The black powder for their harquebuses, their greatest technological advantage, was soaked into useless paste. Their steel armor, a symbol of their invincibility, became a rusty, suffocating cage, cooking them in the oppressive humidity. The walking larder of pigs, unable to cope with the heat and the mud, began to die off or were quickly consumed. The food they carried, sacks of maize and dried meat, became a spoiled, inedible sludge. Hunger, a gnawing, constant companion, set in. The jungle itself was an active, malevolent force. It was not empty. It was alive and it was hostile. In the day, swarms of insects descended, their bites raising painful welts that festered into open sores. At night, the darkness was absolute, filled with the coughing roar of the jaguar, the hiss of unseen reptiles, and the cries of things they could not name. Men who wandered too far from the firelight simply vanished. Venomous snakes, colored like the jungle floor, struck without warning. Caimans, ancient reptiles with eyes like polished stones, lurked in every river and stream. The water itself was a threat, teeming with flesh-eating piranhas and tiny, parasitic fish that could swim up a man's urethra, lodging themselves with sharp spines and causing an agonizing death. Disease swept through the camp like a phantom army. Fevers left men shivering and delirious. Dysentery hollowed them out from the inside. The native porters, unaccustomed to the lowland climate and driven to the point of exhaustion, died by the hundreds. Their bodies were left where they fell, a grim trail marking the expedition's path of decay. The proud Spanish soldiers, the conquistadors who had faced down armies, were reduced to skeletal figures, their eyes wide with fear and a creeping madness. The dream of gold was gone, replaced by a singular desperate prayer: survival. And what of Gonzalo Pizarro? The arrogant commander, the brother of a living god, was breaking. He saw his grand army dissolving around him, consumed by this green labyrinth. But to turn back was to admit failure, to tarnish the Pizarro name. His pride would not allow it. So he pushed them onward, deeper into the abyss. His ambition curdled into a vicious cruelty. He would capture natives from the small, terrified tribes they encountered, torturing them for information about El Dorado. He would chain them, burn them, feed them to his dogs. But they knew nothing. They could only point vaguely east, downriver, anywhere to make the torment stop. And so, fueled by false hope and brutalized whispers, Pizarro forced his dying men to continue their eastward march to nowhere. They had also been told of a País de la Canela, a land of cinnamon, a forest of priceless spice trees that was said to lie on the way to El Dorado. After months of suffering, they stumbled upon it. They found a few scattered trees whose bark had a faint cinnamon-like scent. But it was not the vast, fragrant paradise they had imagined. It was just more jungle. The discovery was not a triumph. It was a bitter mockery, a paltry, worthless prize for the hundreds of lives already lost. The taste of the cinnamon was the taste of ashes in their mouths. By December, the expedition had reached a breaking point. They were starving, lost, and surrounded by a jungle that seemed determined to digest them. They came to the banks of a massive, churning river, the Coca, a tributary of an even greater river none of them could comprehend, the Amazon. It was too wide to cross, its currents too powerful to swim. They were trapped. Hope was all but extinguished. In a final, desperate act, Pizarro ordered his men to construct a boat, a large brigantine, a feat that seemed impossible. They forged nails from the shoes of their dead horses. They used the resin of trees for pitch and their own rotting shirts for sails. Pizarro placed his second in command, a trusted and capable captain named Francisco de Orellana, in charge of the vessel. The plan was simple, born of desperation. Orellana would take the 50 healthiest men, sail downriver, find food, and return within 2 weeks to save the rest of the starving army. As Pizarro watched the makeshift ship, the San Pedro, disappear around a bend in the river, he clung to this last sliver of hope. He believed Orellana was his salvation. He had no idea he had just unleashed a new legend upon the world, and that in his attempt to save his men, he had just sealed their fate. Orellana and his crew would not be back in 2 weeks. They would not be back at all. Francisco de Orellana and his 57 men pushed their makeshift brigantine, the San Pedro, into the churning brown water of the Coca River. The current, swift and powerful, grabbed the hull immediately, pulling them away from Pizarro's miserable camp. For the men left behind, watching the small vessel disappear around a bend in the river was like watching their last candle flicker and die in a hurricane. For Orellana's crew, it was a surge of adrenaline, a rush of purpose. They were the saviors. They were on a mission. The first few days were a blur of frantic energy. The river was a liquid highway, carrying them at an astonishing speed through a landscape that was both monotonous and terrifying. On either side, a solid wall of green rose hundreds of feet into the sky, a suffocating endless jungle that blotted out the sun. The air was thick, wet, and alive with the sounds of unseen creatures, the shriek of monkeys, the buzz of insects the size of small birds, the deep, guttural calls of things they couldn't even imagine. They paddled, they steered, they kept watch, their eyes scanning the dense riverbanks for any sign of a village, a clearing, a human being. They had packed what little food they had, rationing it with brutal discipline. Each man received a few kernels of maize and some dried scraps of meat per day. It wasn't enough. Within a week, the hunger that had plagued them in Pizarro's camp returned with a vengeance. It was a gnawing, hollow ache that turned their thoughts inward, souring their moods and shortening their tempers. The river, their supposed highway to salvation, offered them nothing. The water was muddy and undrinkable. Fishing attempts yielded only strange, bony creatures that were more trouble to catch than they were worth. The 2-week deadline Pizarro had given them came and went. They marked it with a grim silence. By now, they should have been on their way back, their boat laden with manioc and corn. Instead, they were deeper in the wilderness than any European had ever been, and the current that had been their ally was now their jailer. Turning back was impossible. Paddling against the relentless force of the river would be like trying to climb a waterfall. There was only one direction forward. Desperation began to set in. Men grew gaunt, their eyes sinking into their skulls. Their fine European clothes were rotting off their backs, shredded by thorns and mildewed by the constant damp. Fever swept through the crew, leaving men shivering with chills 1 minute and burning with delirium the next. They started boiling their leather belts and the soles of their shoes, chewing on the tough, bitter hide just to have something in their stomachs. The jungle, which had at first seemed a vibrant tapestry of life, now felt like a green tomb. It watched them, silent and menacing. Then, on the 12th day of February 1542, after nearly 2 months on the river, they saw it. A clearing. Huts with thatched roofs. The unmistakable signs of a village. A surge of hope so powerful it was almost painful, shot through the starving crew. But it was immediately followed by a cold spike of fear. Who were these people? Were they the hostile tribes they had been warned about? Orellana, a man who balanced pragmatism with a gambler's nerve, ordered his men to approach cautiously. As the San Pedro drifted closer to the bank, figures emerged from the huts. They were tall, well-built, and carried long spears and bows. They watched the strange, pale-skinned men in their floating wooden house with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. There was a tense standoff. Orellana's men gripped their harquebuses, their hands trembling from weakness. One wrong move, one sign of aggression, and they would be pincushioned with arrows. Orellana raised an empty hand, a universal sign of peace. He called out in the few words of a native dialect he had learned, his voice hoarse. For a long moment nothing happened. Then an older man, clearly the chief, stepped forward. He gestured for them to land. The tribe, the Aperia, took pity on the strange, skeletal visitors. They saw not conquerors but starving men on the brink of death. They offered them food, roasted turtle, plump fish, sweet manioc bread, and gourds of fermented chicha. For Orellana's crew, it was a feast of biblical proportions. They ate until their shrunken stomachs ached, tears of gratitude streaming down their filthy, bearded faces. For several weeks, they stayed with the Aperia, regaining their strength. And it was here, in this small isolated village in the heart of the Amazon, that the legend of El Dorado was reborn. The chief, through gestures and the help of the expedition's 2 captured native guides, told Orellana incredible stories. He spoke of the river they were on, explaining that it was a mere tributary of a much, much larger river ahead. This great river, he said, flowed for weeks through the lands of powerful and wealthy kingdoms. And then he spoke of the most powerful of all, a kingdom far downriver, ruled by fierce warrior women who lived without men. He called them the Kaniapuyara, the great chieftains. He described their cities built of stone and shining in the sun. He spoke of their temples, filled with gold and silver ornaments. He claimed their wealth was so immense that they ate from golden plates, and their ceremonial stools were made of solid gold. To Orellana's men, weak and traumatized, this sounded like a fever dream. Warrior women? Cities of gold? It was a fantasy, but to Orellana it was a sign. It was providence. He looked at his men, their bodies slowly healing but their spirits broken. He thought of Pizarro waiting for him back upriver, a wait that was now utterly hopeless. To attempt the return journey would be suicide. They would starve or be picked off by hostile tribes, or simply be swallowed by the jungle. He gathered his men. He knew what he had to do. He had to convince them to abandon their commander, to break their solemn oath, to commit what was, by Spanish military law, an act of treason. He laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Going back was death. Staying was a slow death. The only path to survival, he argued, was forward, down the great river. He painted a picture not of a desperate retreat, but of a glorious new expedition. They were no longer a rescue party for Gonzalo Pizarro. They were explorers. They were pioneers on the cusp of the greatest discovery in history. He told them the chief stories. He spoke of the warrior women, the Amazons, a name that resonated deeply with men raised on tales of classical Greek heroes. And he spoke of the gold. Oh, the gold. He described a city richer than anything Cortés had found in Mexico, richer than anything Pizarro's own brother had found in Peru. This wasn't just some gilded man in a lake. This was an entire civilization of unimaginable wealth. It was the true El Dorado. The men were torn. They were soldiers. Loyalty was etched into their bones. Abandoning a Pizarro was unthinkable. But the alternative was a slow, agonizing death in a swamp. Orellana's words, a potent cocktail of desperation and greed, began to work on them. The promise of gold was a powerful anesthetic for a guilty conscience. A vote was taken. The decision was almost unanimous. They would not go back. They would renounce their allegiance to Gonzalo Pizarro and declare Francisco de Orellana their new leader, acting directly under the authority of the King of Spain. It was a legalistic fig leaf to cover an act of mutiny, but it was enough. They had a new mission. Find the kingdom of the Amazons. Find the city of gold. They spent the next month in the village, not just recovering but preparing. They built a second, larger brigantine, the Victoria, using nails they salvaged from the shoes of their dead comrades. They were no longer just surviving. They were investing in a future they believed would be paved with gold. As they finally prepared to leave the hospitality of the Aperia, the chief gave Orellana one last piece of advice. He warned him of the Machipero, a powerful and warlike tribe downstream, ruled by a fearsome lord who commanded thousands of warriors. But Orellana was undeterred. He was no longer a second-in-command lost in the jungle. He was a conquistador in his own right, the leader of an expedition into the unknown. He had traded Pizarro's hopeless quest for a legend of his own. He was sailing toward the sunrise, toward a city of warrior women and untold riches. He was sailing toward his destiny, unaware that he was also sailing directly into the heart of a waiting empire. That waiting empire wasn't made of stone and gold. It was made of water, wood, and a million unseen eyes. Francisco de Orellana, the one-eyed conquistador, had split from Pizarro's starving expedition with the simple promise of finding food. Now swept along by a current he couldn't possibly fight, that simple promise was becoming an epic, terrifying, and world-altering mistake. He wasn't just on a river. He and his 50 men, crammed into a hastily built brigantine, had been swallowed by a liquid continent. The river was so wide they often couldn't see the other bank. It wasn't a river. It was a freshwater sea flowing through the heart of a green hell. The jungle wasn't just trees. It was a solid wall on either side, a vertical prison of chaotic life that pressed in on them, suffocating them with its humidity and the constant, deafening thrum of insects and unknown creatures. By day, the sun was a merciless hammer. By night, the darkness was absolute, filled with the splash of caimans, the cough of a jaguar, and the chilling paranoia that every shadow held a spear. Their chronicler, a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal, frantically scribbled in his journal, trying to capture the sheer, overwhelming scale of it all. They were a speck of human ambition adrift in a world that didn't know or care that they existed. Their quest for El Dorado had devolved into the most basic human need: survival. Find the next meal. Survive the next night. Pray the next bend in the river doesn't lead to an ambush. For weeks, their encounters were tense but manageable. They'd see a village, a collection of thatched roofs nestled in a clearing, and approach with a mix of hope and dread. Sometimes they were met with curiosity. Tribes would paddle out in canoes, offering turtles, parrots, and cassava bread in exchange for trinkets, glass beads, and tiny bells that seemed to fascinate them. In these moments, a flicker of the old dream returned. Orellana would ask through translators about the rich lands, the powerful lords, the city of the sun. The natives would point. Always they pointed downstream. Further on. Keep going. The rich lands are that way. Was it a lie to get rid of them? Or was it the truth? It didn't matter. The current gave them no choice but to believe. But as they drifted deeper into the Amazon basin, the welcomes grew colder. The curiosity in the eyes of the natives was replaced by a hard, calculating stare. The gifts of food stopped. Instead, they were greeted by the sound of war drums, a deep rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the hull of their boat and into their bones. It was the jungle's own heartbeat, and it was beating against them. The attacks came without warning. A volley of 6-foot-long arrows, tipped with poison, would rain down from the dense foliage. The Spaniards, with their heavy armor and clumsy crossbows, were at a total disadvantage. The natives were ghosts, striking from the cover of the trees and then melting back into the green labyrinth, their canoes moving with a speed and agility the Europeans couldn't comprehend. Orellana's men learned to sleep in shifts, to never lower their guard, to live with the constant, gnawing fear that death could come from any direction at any moment. One day, Carvajal the friar was struck. An arrow pierced his side, but by a miracle it missed his vital organs. As his companions pulled the shaft out, another arrow struck him squarely in the face, passing through one eye and out the side of his head. He collapsed, blinded, certain he was dead. Yet he survived. He would continue to write his journal, a one-eyed chronicler for a one-eyed captain, documenting a journey into the abyss. They were starving, wounded, and thousands of miles from any known Spanish settlement. The dream of El Dorado was a bitter joke. And then they came to the lands of the Aykamiabas. The drums were the first warning, louder, more numerous than any they had heard before. As they rounded a bend, they saw it. A massive village stretching for miles along the riverbank with warriors lined up waiting for them. But something was different. As the Spaniards raised their crossbows and arquebus, preparing for the inevitable fight, they saw them. Standing at the front, directing the men, were figures that defied all their understanding of this new world. Carvajal, his one good eye wide with disbelief, described them later. They were tall, well-built, with pale skin and long dark hair braided and wrapped around their heads. They were completely naked, armed with bows and arrows, and they fought with a ferocity that stunned the battle-hardened conquistadors. They moved with a terrifying grace, shouting commands, and seemed to be the leaders of the entire force. They were women. The Spaniards were thrown into chaos. These were the warrior women from the Greek myths, the Amazons, made real in the heart of the jungle. They fought not like women were supposed to fight, but like demons. Carvajal wrote that they treated the male warriors as subordinates, and if any man dared to retreat, the women would club him to death right there on the spot. Orellana's men fired their guns, the explosions echoing across the water, but the warriors, led by their female captains, did not flinch. They unleashed such a thick storm of arrows that the Spaniards' brigantine looked, in Carvajal's words, like a porcupine. The battle was a desperate, brutal affair. For hours, the Spaniards fought to keep from being overrun, their small boat a floating fortress under siege. Orellana himself was a whirlwind of action, shouting orders, his one eye blazing with the fury of a cornered animal. Finally, through a combination of sheer luck and the stopping power of their firearms, they managed to break away, pushing back out into the main current. leaving the village and its terrifying defenders behind. They had survived, but their minds were reeling. Who were those women? Later, interrogating a captured native, they were told a story that solidified the legend. The captive explained that these women lived in a kingdom with no men. They were ruled by a queen named Kanori. Their city was built of white stone, and their temples were roofed with feathers. But inside, the captive said the houses and temples were filled with gold and silver. They only allowed men from neighboring tribes to visit at certain times of the year for the sole purpose of procreation. Male children were killed or sent back to their fathers. Female children were raised to be the next generation of warriors. It was everything the Europeans had ever dreamed of and feared. A city of warrior women. A city of gold. It was the legend of the Amazons and the legend of El Dorado crashing together into one unbelievable reality. The river from that day forward would have a new name. The Amazon. Orellana and his men never saw those women again. They continued their desperate journey, fighting off starvation, disease, and near-constant attacks. After 8 months and nearly 4,000 miles, a journey longer than Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, the impossible happened. They saw the open ocean. The water turned from brown to green, the air grew salty, and the exhausted, skeletal crew of the Victoria finally tasted the Atlantic. They were the first Europeans to ever traverse the entire length of the world's greatest river. They had achieved one of the most incredible feats of exploration in human history. They had survived the unsurvivable, but they returned with no gold, no jewels, no proof of the riches they sought. All they had was a story. A wild, unbelievable story of a river so vast it was called a sea, of cannibalistic tribes, and of a kingdom of fierce warrior women whose city was filled with gold. And in the courts of Europe, that story was worth more than gold itself. Orellana hadn't found El Dorado, but he had given it a location. He had given it a landmark. The lost city of gold was no longer just a myth whispered by a single captive in the Andes. It was real. It was out there, somewhere along the banks of the mighty Amazon River, guarded by a legion of warrior women. The failure of Orellana's expedition became the single greatest catalyst for the legend's growth. He had set out to find a city of gold and failed, but in doing so he had created a continent-sized treasure map, and now everyone in Europe wanted to be the one to solve it. The real fever was only just beginning. The real fever was only just beginning. Orellana's wild tale of warrior women and golden cities on the Amazon had lit a fire in the imagination of Europe. But imagination is one thing. Financing an expedition is another. The Spanish crown, despite the rivers of silver and gold flowing from Mexico and Peru, was perpetually in debt. Wars are expensive, and King Charles V had a lot of them, and when a king needs money, he turns to bankers. In this case, he turned to the Welsers, an obscenely wealthy German banking family from Augsburg. They were the 16th century equivalent of a multinational investment bank, and the Spanish king owed them a fortune. So they struck a deal so audacious it's hard to believe it even happened. In 1528, to settle his debts, Charles granted the Welser family a massive concession. He essentially leased them an entire province of the New World, a vast unexplored territory that makes up most of modern-day Venezuela. He named it Klein Venedig, or Little Venice. The Welsers were given the rights to explore, to colonize, and most importantly, to exploit whatever riches they found. It was the ultimate speculative investment. The bankers were now conquistadors. And so the search for El Dorado took a strange corporate turn. The Germans arrived, not with the same religious zeal as the Spanish, but with a cold, calculated hunger for a return on their investment. Among them was a young, ambitious nobleman named Philip von Hutten. He wasn't a grizzled, battle-scarred veteran like Pizarro or Cortez. He was a well-educated, cultured young man, a page in the court of the king, who saw the New World as the ultimate path to fame and fortune. He sailed for Venezuela in 1535, full of romantic notions of chivalry and adventure. The jungle would soon cure him of those. His first expedition was a brutal education. Under the command of another German, George von Speyer, Hutten and 400 men marched south from the coastal settlement of Coro, chasing rumors of a golden kingdom deep in the interior. For 3 years they hacked their way through a world that seemed actively hostile to human life. They crossed the vast, sun-scorched plains known as the Llanos, a sea of grass that flooded in the wet season and baked into a dust bowl in the dry. They waded through swamps teeming with caimans and anacondas, their bodies tormented by insects they had no names for. Malaria, dysentery, and starvation became their constant companions. They fought desperate, bloody skirmishes with indigenous tribes who viewed them, correctly, as violent intruders. They followed every whisper, every rumor, every vague hand gesture from a terrified captive pointing them further south, always further south. They heard stories of the Omagua people, a powerful tribe said to possess great wealth, but they never found them. After 3 years of unimaginable suffering, a handful of survivors, including Houghton, staggered back to Coro. They were skeletal, ravaged by disease, with nothing to show for their ordeal but scars and feverish memories. Over 80% of the men who had marched out with them were dead, swallowed by the jungle. For most people, this would have been the end. A sane person would have taken the first ship back to Europe and never spoken of that green hell again. But Philip von Houghton was not a sane person. He was an obsessed person. The taste of failure was more bitter than any jungle poison. The whispers of the Omagua and their city had become a siren song in his mind. He was convinced they had just been on the wrong path, that they had turned back just shy of their goal. In 1541, he got his chance to prove it. Now in command of his own expedition, he gathered about 150 men, a mix of German and Spanish adventurers, and set out once more. This time he would not fail. He was older, harder, and he knew the brutal calculus of the jungle. He pushed his men relentlessly, retracing his steps into the Llanos, but then veering west, deeper into the unknown, toward the headwaters of the Amazon basin. For more than a year they marched. The journey was a recurring nightmare of the one he had already survived. Men died from snake bites, from infected wounds, from sheer exhaustion. They ate their horses, then their dogs, then boiled leather straps from their armor to make a thin, pitiful broth. But Houghton's iron will drove them forward. And then, after nearly 18 months of wandering in this purgatory, they found it. On the banks of a large river, they came across a network of well-maintained roads, wider and better constructed than any they had seen in the New World. They followed them, and the roads led them to a city. A real city. It was vast, stretching for miles along the riverbank. Thousands of people moved through its streets. In the center was a large, imposing building, a temple or a palace, that gleamed in the tropical sun. This was the capital of the Omaguas. Could this be it? The city they had bled for, the source of all the rumors? Was this El Dorado? Houghton, his heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and terror, decided on a reconnaissance mission. He took a small party of his best 40 horsemen and charged into the city's outskirts. The Omaguas were not intimidated. Thousands of warriors poured out to meet them, firing clouds of arrows and wielding long spears. The Europeans, with their steel armor and horses, were a formidable force, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. A fierce battle erupted in the streets of the city. Houghton fought like a man possessed, but as he wheeled his horse around, an Omagua warrior lunged forward and thrust a spear through his side, the iron point punching clean through his armor. He slumped over his horse, gravely wounded. His men, seeing their leader fall, panicked. They fought their way back out of the city, dragging their bleeding commander with them, and retreated into the jungle. The city of gold, the prize they had sought for so long, remained just out of reach, defended by its furious inhabitants. The journey back was a slow-motion catastrophe. Houghton lay in a makeshift litter, delirious with fever from his festering wound, which his companions had to treat with cauterization, searing the flesh with a hot iron. They were starving, defeated, and haunted by the vision of the city they had found and lost. It took them another year to limp their way back towards the coast, a ragged band of ghosts emerging from the wilderness. After more than 4 years away, they finally neared the settlement of Coro, expecting a hero's welcome. But there would be no welcome. While Houghton was lost in the jungle, the world had changed. The Welsers Grant had fallen into chaos and mismanagement. The Spanish crown, tired of the Germans' failures to produce profits, had sent a new governor to restore order. His name was Juan de Carvajal, a man of boundless ambition and zero scruples. Carvajal had already established a new capital and had no intention of letting some half-dead German adventurer show up and challenge his authority. When Houghton and his few remaining followers arrived, they didn't find a friendly garrison. They found Carvajal. The meeting was tense. Carvajal saw Houghton not as a heroic explorer, but as a rival. He accused Houghton of trying to usurp his authority, of operating outside the law. Hutton, weak and still recovering from his wound, tried to reason with him, explaining he was still operating under the authority of the Welser Grant. But Carvajal wasn't interested in legal arguments. He saw a threat and he decided to eliminate it. In the dead of night, Carvajal's men surrounded Hutton's camp. Hutton and his loyal second-in-command were dragged from their hammocks, bound in chains, and subjected to a sham trial. Carvajal, acting as judge and jury, declared them guilty of treason. Philip von Hutton, the man who had survived years in the most hostile environment on Earth, who had stared down starvation and disease, who had gotten closer than any European to a great inland city of the Amazon, was not going to be killed by a poison dart or a jaguar. He was going to be murdered by a petty paranoid bureaucrat. He and his lieutenant were led out into a clearing. There was no priest, no last rites, just the cold, political calculation of arrival. By Juan de Carvajal's order, Philip von Hutton was unceremoniously beheaded with a machete. His quest for a city of gold ended right there, in the dirt thousands of miles from home. The man was dead, but his story was not. The tale of the great city of the Omaguas, the city he had seen with his own eyes, would escape the jungle. It would become another electrifying piece of the puzzle, another confirmation that El Dorado was real, and it was out there waiting. And it would inspire the most famous and most tragic expedition of them all. His name was Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, and he was a man forged from a different kind of steel. A decorated British artillery officer, a surveyor, a spy, and a mystic, Fawcett was a living legend long before he vanished. He was a man who seemed immune to the jungle's horrors. While others succumbed to disease, starvation, and fear, Fawcett seemed to thrive. He could go for days with little food, navigate terrain that swallowed other men whole, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to connect with indigenous tribes that were hostile to everyone else. His men called him the man who would not die. But Fawcett wasn't looking for the El Dorado of the Spanish conquistadors. He wasn't driven by a lust for gold or jewels. His obsession was grander, more esoteric. He believed that deep within the Amazon, hidden under a canopy of impenetrable green, lay the ruins of a civilization so ancient it predated even the Egyptians. He called it simply Z. To Fawcett, El Dorado was a corrupted memory, a folktale whose golden glimmer was just a faint echo of a much deeper truth. Z was not a city of gold, but a city of light, the last remnant of an advanced white-skinned race, perhaps survivors of Atlantis itself, who had built a sprawling metropolis of white stone and sophisticated engineering. This was the ultimate prize, not just a treasure, but the key to understanding the very origins of human civilization. It was a theory that the scientific establishment of the early 20th century openly mocked. But Fawcett was not a man easily deterred by mockery. His conviction was fueled by more than just romantic theory. In the National Library of Rio de Janeiro, he had discovered a dusty, tattered document known as Manuscript 512. It was a report, written by a Portuguese explorer in 1753, detailing the discovery of a vast, abandoned stone city in the heart of the Brazilian jungle. The manuscript described wide streets, a grand plaza, a multi-storied palace, and towering black stone arches carved with strange, unfamiliar hieroglyphs. It was a tantalizing, concrete piece of evidence that a complex civilization had once existed exactly where Fawcett believed it would be. This document became his Bible, his treasure map. Twice before 1925, he had ventured into the jungle in search of Z, and twice the jungle had thrown him back. His expeditions were biblical trials of suffering. He and his men endured torrential rains, swarms of insects that blotted out the sun, vampire bats, anacondas, and the constant, gnawing threat of starvation. On one trip, they were forced to shoot their pack animals and eat them, only to watch their own bodies begin to fail. Yet through it all, Fawcett's resolve never wavered. Each failure only hardened his belief that he was getting closer, that Z was real and was testing him, allowing only the worthy to approach. Then, in 1925, he decided to make one last attempt. He was 57 years old, but his will was as strong as ever. This time, he would do things differently. His previous expeditions had been too large, too noisy, too prone to mutiny and weakness. This time, the party would be lean, a tight-knit commando unit of 3: Fawcett himself, his 21-year-old son Jack, and Jack's best friend Raleigh Rimmel. Jack was strong and loyal, trained by his father to be an expert woodsman. Raleigh was chosen for his physical endurance and cheerful disposition. Fawcett believed their youth and loyalty would be their armor against the jungle's psychological warfare. He secured funding from the Royal Geographical Society and a consortium of American newspapers, who all salivated at the prospect of the story he might bring back. Before he left, Fawcett made a curious and ultimately chilling declaration. He made it clear that if they went missing, under no circumstances should a rescue party be sent. The jungle was too dangerous, he argued. Any rescue attempt would be doomed to fail and would only lead to more death. It was a premonition that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The trio set off from Cuiabá, the capital of the Mato Grosso state in Brazil, in April 1925. For the first month, their progress was well documented. A series of letters and dispatches, carried back by native runners, painted a picture of a difficult but optimistic journey. They were making good time, their spirits were high, and Fawcett was confident he was on the right track. The final communication came on May 29, 1925. It was a letter from Fawcett to his wife, Nina, carried out of the jungle by a runner. The letter was dispatched from a location he called Dead Horse Camp, so named because it was where his horse had died on a previous expedition. In the letter, he was as confident as ever. He wrote, "You need have no fear of any failure." He described Jack as being well and strong, and noted that Raleigh was complaining about insect bites but was otherwise holding up. He gave their coordinates and explained their next objective was a waterfall he had seen years before. He believed his lost city of Z lay just beyond it. And then silence. The letter ended. The dispatches stopped. The runners returned no more. Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel walked into the green unknown and simply vanished from the face of the earth. For 2 years the world waited. The newspapers that had funded him held off, respecting his command not to send rescuers. But as the silence stretched from months into years, a dreadful certainty began to set in. The man who would not die was gone. What followed was one of the greatest and most tragic manhunts in modern history. The mystery of the Fawcett expedition became a global obsession. What had happened to them? The theories were as wild and numerous as the jungle's dangers. The most straightforward, and perhaps most likely theory was that they were killed by one of the region's uncontacted and hostile tribes, like the Kalapalo or the Savant. Over the years, stories and rumors would trickle out of the jungle. Tales of 3 white men being captured and executed, stories passed down through generations of tribesmen. Some even claimed to have seen Jack's bones, or a tin box belonging to the expedition. But none of these claims ever led to conclusive proof. Another theory was that they simply succumbed to the jungle itself. An accident, a venomous snake bite, a sudden illness, or simple starvation. In a place where a single misstep could be fatal, it was all too easy to imagine a scenario where the 3 men, weakened and isolated, were simply reclaimed by the wilderness, their bodies lost forever beneath the forest floor. But there was a third, more romantic theory, one that Fawcett himself might have appreciated. This theory proposed that they didn't fail at all. They succeeded. It suggested that Fawcett actually found Z. He found his lost city, his ancient civilization, and either by choice or by force he never left. Perhaps he was welcomed into a society that had remained hidden for millennia and chose to stay. Or perhaps he was made a prisoner, forbidden from ever revealing its location to the outside world. The pull of this mystery was irresistible. Despite Fawcett's explicit warnings, dozens of would-be rescuers, glory seekers, and journalists plunged into the Mato Grosso to find him. These search parties were a catalog of disaster. Over the next few decades, an estimated 100 people would die in the Amazon while searching for Percy Fawcett. They were shot with poison arrows, they starved, they drowned, they died of disease, or they simply disappeared just as he had. The jungle that had swallowed Fawcett and his team seemed hungry for more. Fawcett's disappearance did something profound to the legend of El Dorado. He had transformed it. The quest was no longer about gold. It was about something far more potent. A lost world, a hidden truth, a mystery that defied a rational explanation. He had taken the myth of the Golden Man and fused it with the modern yearning for discovery, for proof that we are not alone in our history, that great secrets still lie waiting in the blank spots on the map. His tragic, unanswered fate ensured that the legend would not die. Instead, it became more powerful than ever. A ghost story whispered on a global scale, drawing a new generation of believers and explorers into the very same jungle that had claimed the great man himself. And so the 20th century roared on, an age of machines and science, Yet it was utterly captivated by this very old, very human mystery. The disappearance of Percy Fawcett wasn't just a news story. It was a wound in the collective psyche of the Western world. He was the embodiment of the indomitable explorer, the man who could not be beaten. For the jungle to simply swallow him whole was an unacceptable ending. And so the world sent more men. Dozens of expeditions, over 100 would-be rescuers, plunged into the Amazon with the singular goal of finding Fawcett, or at least finding an answer. They were funded by newspapers, geographical societies, and wealthy patrons, all desperate to solve the mystery that had captured the globe. But the jungle, as always, was indifferent. It guarded its secrets with a quiet, patient lethality. These rescue missions became their own grim legends. Some explorers vanished without a trace, just like the man they sought. Others returned with harrowing tales of disease, hostile tribes, and the maddening psychological pressure of the endless green. They found nothing. No body, no campsite, no definitive proof. All they found were stories, whispers from remote tribes about a tall, blue-eyed white man who had passed through years ago. Some said he had been killed. Others claimed he had gone native, becoming a chief of a lost tribe, willingly leaving his old world behind. One particularly cruel rumor, a fabricated story involving Fawcett's shrunken head, made headlines before being debunked. The mystery deepened with every failed attempt, every conflicting report. The search for Fawcett became a more dangerous and alluring quest than El Dorado itself. But as the years turned into decades, a slow, crucial shift began to occur. The generation that knew Fawcett faded away. The desperate search for a man was gradually replaced by a renewed search for his idea. The focus turned from his fate back to his obsession, the lost city of Z. And now the quest was armed with a weapon Fawcett could have only dreamed of: the view from the heavens. After World War II, aircraft began charting the vast, unknown territories of the Amazon basin. For the first time, humanity could see the forest not as an impenetrable wall of green, but as a vast topographical map. And from the air, they started seeing things that made no sense. Strange patterns in the landscape, perfectly straight lines, perfect circles, and massive squares carved into the earth, often in areas far from any known settlement. They were geoglyphs, enormous earthworks, some stretching for hundreds of feet, too large to be appreciated from the ground. Their true form was only visible from the sky. Who built them? And why? They were silent, geometric ghosts on the landscape, proof of an organized, sophisticated presence that orthodox archaeology said shouldn't be there. This was only the beginning. The Cold War space race, in its quest for military surveillance, gave scientists an even more powerful tool: satellite imagery. As satellites began to orbit the Earth, their cameras peeling back the secrets of our planet, they revealed something astonishing in the Amazon. Deforestation, a tragedy for the environment, had an unintended side effect. As vast swaths of forest were cleared for cattle ranching, the scars of an ancient world were exposed on the naked earth. The geoglyphs were just the start. Satellites revealed networks of raised causeways, canals, and moats, all part of a massive interconnected system of land management. The evidence was irrefutable. The Amazon was not a virgin wilderness, untouched by man. It was a garden, a vast, man-made park that had been meticulously managed for centuries before the arrival of Europeans. This shattered a century of scientific dogma. The prevailing theory had always been that the Amazon soil was too poor to support large-scale agriculture, and therefore, it could never have been home to a large, sedentary civilization. No big cities, no complex societies, no El Dorado, but archaeologists on the ground, following the clues from the sky, began to find the proof that turned this theory to dust. They found a secret in the soil itself, a rich, black, and incredibly fertile earth that stood in stark contrast to the nutrient-poor clay around it. They called it Terra Preta do Indio, the Indian black earth. Chemical analysis revealed it wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was man-made, a mixture of charcoal, pottery shards, bone, and compost, created over generations by a people who had mastered their environment. They hadn't just lived in the jungle, they had engineered it. They had created a soil that could sustain massive populations. The floodgates of discovery were now open. In the Upper Xingu region of Brazil, the very area Fawcett was exploring, archaeologists like Michael Heckenberger, working alongside the local Kikuro people, uncovered something extraordinary. Using GPS and satellite data, they mapped a sprawling network of ancient settlements, dating back to a time long before Columbus. These were not small, isolated villages. They were meticulously planned communities, complete with large central plazas, defensive moats, and massive roads, some over 150 feet wide, that connected them in a precise grid-like pattern. It was a system of decentralized suburban-style urbanism, a web of garden cities that housed tens of thousands of people. They had found a civilization, not a single city of gold, but something far more complex, more sustainable, and in many ways more impressive. Suddenly, the old stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The chronicles of Francisco de Orellana, who spoke of great cities and highways on his journey down the Amazon, were long dismissed as fantasy, the ravings of a man desperate for fame. But now, here was the proof. The roads were real. The large settlements were real. The massive populations were real. The history of the Amazon was being completely rewritten. The people who built this world were not simple hunter-gatherers. They were astronomers, engineers, and agriculturalists of the highest order. They had built a civilization so perfectly integrated with the forest that when it collapsed, likely due to the European diseases that swept ahead of the conquistadors, the forest simply grew back over it, hiding it from sight for 500 years. El Dorado was real, just not in the way anyone had expected. The real treasure wasn't a mountain of gold, but the knowledge of a lost civilization that had thrived in the world's most challenging environment. The legend had been a distorted echo, a memory of this great society passed down through generations, eventually becoming encrusted with the European obsession for gold. Fawcett, with his talk of a sophisticated city he called Z, had been closer to the truth than anyone knew. He wasn't chasing a fantasy, he was chasing a ghost, a folk memory of this very real, very advanced Amazonian society. The paradigm had shifted. The question was no longer, could a city like El Dorado exist? Science had answered that with a resounding yes. The new question was, where was its center? These garden cities were impressive, but they seemed to be part of a larger network. Was there a capital? A central hub? A true metropolis that was the heart of this vast civilization? The final, missing piece of the puzzle? For decades, that question remained unanswerable. The technology existed to prove the civilization was real, but finding its core in a jungle basin the size of the continental United States seemed impossible. The canopy was still too thick, the ground too remote. But then, at the dawn of the 21st century, came a technology that would change everything. A technology that could do what no satellite or airplane ever could. It could see through the trees. It's called LiDAR, a system that uses lasers fired from an aircraft to map the ground in three-dimensional detail, digitally erasing the canopy to reveal the topography of the forest floor. And in the last few years, archaeologists have begun pointing this laser-powered eye at the most inaccessible, unexplored corners of the Amazon. And in a remote part of Bolivia, an area long rumored to hold ancient secrets, they turned on the lasers and they found it. A pattern in the earth. The unmistakable signature of pyramids, causeways, and canals, on a scale never seen before. A city hidden in plain sight, its existence completely unknown, until now. The implications were staggering. For centuries, the world had believed the Amazon was a virgin wilderness, a vast green emptiness, home only to small scattered tribes. The idea of large urban societies here was dismissed as fantasy, the fever dreams of gold-crazed conquistadors. But the LiDAR data was undeniable. This wasn't a small settlement. It was a sprawling, interconnected network of urban centers, a form of low-density tropical urbanism that had no known parallel. Archaeologists named it the Casarabe culture. Flourishing between 500 and 1400 AD in what is now northern Bolivia, these people were masters of their environment. The laser scans revealed two massive primary sites, Cotoca and Landivar, surrounded by at least 24 smaller, secondary sites, all integrated into a single cohesive system. They weren't just living in the jungle, they had engineered it. The scans showed a web of perfectly straight causeways, some stretching for miles, raised 5 or 6 feet above the seasonally flooded savanna, connecting settlements, ceremonial centers, and reservoirs. They built massive conical pyramids and U-shaped ceremonial structures, all aligned with cosmic precision. They constructed a vast and intricate water management system, with canals and reservoirs designed to control the region's 8-month-long dry seasons and dramatic annual floods. They didn't conquer the jungle. They harmonized with it, creating a vast, sustainable garden city that supported a large population for nearly 1,000 years. So was this it? After 500 years of searching, had we finally found El Dorado? The answer, of course, is no. Not in the way the Spanish imagined it. There were no temples plated in gold, no streets paved with emeralds. The treasure of the Kasaraib culture wasn't a metal you could melt down and ship back to Europe. Their wealth was in their knowledge. Their treasure was the land itself, a landscape they had meticulously crafted to sustain them. They were agricultural engineers, astronomers, and city planners of the highest order. They built a civilization in a place the world thought was uninhabitable. And then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, they vanished. Sometime around the year 1400, a century before Columbus even set sail, the Kasaraib civilization collapsed. The causeways fell into disuse, the canals dried up, and the relentless green of the Amazon slowly, patiently, reclaimed everything. Perhaps it was prolonged drought or a social upheaval, or a disease we have yet to identify. We simply don't know. By the time the first Europeans arrived in the region, bringing with them their own devastating plagues, the great cities were already empty, the people who built them a distant memory, their story told only by the subtle geometric shapes they had left on the land, shapes that would remain invisible to the naked eye for the next 600 years. This is the profound, beautiful irony of the El Dorado legend. The conquistadors, blinded by their lust for gold, were literally walking over the ruins of a civilization far more sophisticated and valuable than they could ever comprehend. They were searching for a city of metal, while standing on a city of earth and water. They listened for whispers of gold and silver, but they were deaf to the story the land itself was trying to tell them. The legend they created, the myth of a golden city, was a crude and distorted echo of a much deeper truth. The Amazon was not empty. It was once home to millions. It was a place of cities, of engineering, of culture. And the Kasaraib are not alone. All across the Amazon basin, from Brazil to Ecuador, LiDAR and other technologies are now revealing a lost world of ancient civilizations. Massive geoglyphs carved into the earth, the remains of fortified towns, and vast networks of raised agricultural fields. It's a complete rewriting of the history of the Americas. The Amazon wasn't a wilderness that was conquered. It was a civilization that was lost. A civilization that was so thoroughly erased by time and disease and colonial ambition that its very existence was relegated to the realm of myth. This changes everything. It changes our understanding of human history, of what's possible in so-called hostile environments. But it also changes our understanding of the Amazon itself. The rainforest we see today, the one we fight to protect as a bastion of untouched nature, is in many ways a human artifact. It's a garden, regrown over the ruins of forgotten cities. Many of the plants and trees we think of as wild were in fact cultivated and managed by these ancient peoples for centuries. The Brazil nut tree, for example, is almost always found near archaeological sites. It's a ghost of an ancient orchard. This discovery doesn't diminish the rainforest's value. It deepens it. It tells us that for millennia, humans and the Amazon coexisted in a complex, managed balance. A balance we have tragically lost. The search for El Dorado has been a 500-year-long odyssey of hope, greed, madness, and death. It drove men to the brink of insanity and beyond, cost thousands of lives. It fueled an age of exploration and conquest that reshaped the world. And for 500 years it was seen as a story of failure. A fool's errand. A wild goose chase for a city that never was. But perhaps we've been looking at it all wrong. The legend of El Dorado wasn't a map to a place. It was a signpost pointing to a forgotten truth. The real treasure wasn't a hoard of gold waiting to be plundered. The real treasure was the story itself. A story so powerful, so alluring, that it kept pulling people back into the heart of the continent generation after generation, until finally, armed with technology our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of, we were able to see what was there all along. The gold wasn't in a lost city. It was in the discovery that the Amazon was once filled with cities. The treasure wasn't a golden king. It was the knowledge of the millions of people who lived and died there, who built societies of incredible complexity, and then vanished into the mists of time. The legend of El Dorado is not a lie. It is a profoundly human story. A story about how we project our own desires onto the unknown. A story about how a myth born from a kernel of truth can take on a life of its own, becoming more real than reality itself. And it is a story that proves that sometimes, The greatest treasures are the ones hidden in plain sight, waiting not for a conqueror with a sword, but for a scientist with a question. The search is over. But the real work, the work of understanding who these people were and what they can teach us, has only just begun. The lost city of gold was never found, but in its place we found a lost world. And that is a treasure of infinitely greater worth.